Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of the Belgian Football Podcast. My name is Ben Jackson. I'll be your host for this one. And as always, I'm joined by Scott. Unfortunately, no Joris, but Scott, how are you doing this evening?
Hey Ben, how are you? I'm terribly excited about this one. Been waiting to do this recording for almost a year, but it has been worth the wait.
Absolutely. I think we've teased this one for a couple of months now, but we are finally sitting down with James Kelly to talk about his new book on Belgian football culture. The book is called Golden: Why Belgian Football is More Than One Generation, and it's out now. Published by Pitch Publishing. James, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us for a little chat.
No, it's all right, Ben. No problem at all. Thank you very much for having me on. As Scott says, I've been waiting myself an awfully long time to come on the podcast. It's going to be great to go into the book and go through it a little bit more with you and give you a few sort of weird and wonderful details of how it's come about and some of the structuring processes of it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're here for. For those that don't know, James is a freelance football writer. He's written for World Soccer Magazine, 442, The Guardian, These Football Times. But Golden is your first book, I believe. So absolutely delighted that you've done a book on Belgian football. We were just saying before we came on air, me and Scott and Joris, when we started this podcast, were like, there's just not a book about Belgian football in English that we can just get our teeth into and kind of get some content out of that we need to kind of give us a little bit more background history. And then I think literally a couple of weeks later, we saw that you were writing this book. So that was a perfect kind of answer to all of our prayers and questions. I'll just quickly give an overview of the book for those who haven't got it yet. There may be a way of getting one through us later on in the podcast. I'll save that for the end. But it's, as I said, the kind of first book in English. And it basically, we go all the way back to the start of kind of Belgian football culture and the start of Belgian football. James basically covers everything in this book. I think me and Scott were saying there's absolutely nothing, no stone left unturned, I guess you could say. But also there's plenty of scope for anyone else out there who's an author who thinks, oh, this sounds like an interesting piece of the Belgian football history puzzle to take over and do like a story on. But yeah, we go through kind of the chapters. Myself, I'm halfway through. Scott, I know you finished it. I'm absolutely loving it so far. But we start off with the kind of the origins of football in Belgium. The emergence of Anderlecht kind of takes us through the second chapter. A bit more about Anderlecht in Europe. Roger Klaassen in the early days of Standard Liège. Raymond Gotthal, St. Truden. Gothal's time as head coach of the Red Devils. Ernst Happel, of course, a whole section on him and the emergence of Club Brugge. Anderlecht under Hans Kroon and the Snake Man, I think he was called, wasn't he? Robbie Rensenbrink. Then we go on to Guy Thys and the Red Devils, 1980 European Championship final against West Germany. Red Devils at the 1982 World Cup. The Heysel Stadium disaster in 1985. Red Devils at the 1986 World Cup in Mexico. A look at probably Scott's favourite chapter, titled Malinois. I'm sure you can all understand why. A little look at Mechelen. Look at Enzo Schifo as well. I know his name was popping up the other day on who people think the greatest Belgian footballer of all time is. So you can read the whole chapter on Enzo there. Antwerp and a 1993 Cup Winners' Cup final. Jean-Marc Bosman with the Bosman ruling, obviously one of the big kind of developments in football. The decline of the Red Devils, so kind of the fallout from the Bosman, the Euro 2000 embarrassment, and kind of, that steady decline before the kind of the new approach and the future, looking ahead to what is to come from Belgian football. So, James, the first question we've got here is it fair to say that this book is all the fault of Paul van Himst?
Well, I think pretty much, yeah. I mean, it was basically, I think it was, when was it? December 2020. Yeah, it was the sort of kind of, I can't lose track of them. Second lockdown, I think it was. And basically, I was reading about Paul van Himst and I kind of thought, well, he seems like quite an interesting bloke. I've never really heard much about him at all, to be honest. And then I kind of, read a few things online, and then I kind of thought, well, in all fairness, this Anderlecht team he played in were quite good. Let's have a look if there's a book on football in Belgium, because obviously, during lockdowns, not a whole lot to do sort of in the evenings. You can't really go anywhere. So I thought, let's have a look if there's any books out there. And I was really, really surprised there wasn't. I think, like you were saying before, I was really surprised there wasn't anything on Belgian football history because, every other nation, I've got books about, obviously the bigger nations, but I've got books about like Hungary and the Netherlands and Denmark and kind of like nations of comparative size. But there was, as you say, there's just nothing on Belgium, and I thought this is really, really strange. Why isn't this a case? And then I kind of was just busy doing other stuff, and then it came to a time where I'd kind of finished postgrad journalism course that I was doing, and I thought, well, I've kind of got a little bit of a not career break, but I've got quite the time now to do a book on Belgium, and I thought, well, I've always wanted to write a book anyway, and as I say, the fact there was nothing on it, I thought, you know what, this is a good a topic as I'm going to find. So let's give it a go. And yeah, with the help of many, many people, including both of yourselves and Joris, who will hear this when he's editing it, we were able to bring it home safely into harbour.
Yeah, I was just going to say, James, I think you've done not only us here at the BFP, but obviously everybody who's been enjoying the book a great service, because I think, it's quite a significant book, this, for that reason. One of the things the book highlights, which I really enjoyed when I was reading it, is that there's this wonderful kind of, I've been using the word odyssey, actually, when I've been making my own notes around the kind of the Belgian football story, if you like. And so much of it is actually untold. There are little pockets. I mean, Van Himst obviously is a great example. Here's a player who I think a lot of people still probably don't know very much about. And this book, really kind of flushes out what you might kind of call hidden histories around all sorts of things. And you come away from this book, or at least I did, and I thought I knew quite a lot about Belgian football, which I think I do, but I came away from it knowing even more, which is great, because it had uncovered things that even I wasn't kind of fully aware of, that I'm definitely going to spend some time digging a bit deeper on some things now. But you've done a lot of people a great service, and it's just a joy to have that reference there now, I think.
Thanks very much. Like it does mean an awful lot, as I say. It's the sort of thing where when I started off, it was really not, say it wasn't for anyone else. Obviously, I wanted people to read it, and I still want people to read it if they haven't yet got the book. And I'm obviously a bit biased, but I would advise them to get it and give it a read. But yeah, it was initially kind of almost just for myself, in the sense that, as I say, I had this own kind of like personal intrigue for whatever reason, that I just wanted to find out more about football in Belgium. And I think that was almost kind of, it sounds really sort of like esoteric saying this, but I think that kind of did help me get through the book, in the sense that I had this kind of like own desire to find out stuff, that it kind of that carried me through as much as actually having a contract that I needed to fulfill to finish the book.
I think that definitely comes across in the way you write it as well. You can tell that you have that level of interest in kind of the little stories and the intrigue. You also mentioned kind of early on in the book that you based yourself in Ghent and Liège when you did write it. So I kind of guess our question on those is why those two cities, obviously big footballing kind of cities in terms of clubs, but why those two specifically and not like a Brussels or a Bruges?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, initially I was just going to go to Ghent on the basis that I kind of thought, well, ultimately, of all the places that I need to visit, I thought, Ghent's kind of not equidistant, but it's kind of in the middle of sort of Antwerp, Brussels and Bruges. So I thought it's quite a good base to be able to, pop on a train. Obviously, Belgium being the size it is, you can get anywhere really in sort of 2-3 hours. So I kind of thought it's a good base, and also, in itself, it's a gorgeous place. And I've always heard good stories. Weirdly, one of the people that recommended it, probably the main person actually that made me think about going there, was my barber. I seem to remember him saying that his brother goes to Ghent quite regularly and always likes it. And for it's one of those things that I always trust my barber's judgment on places to visit. He seems to have a very, honestly, it's the sort of thing where I think if ever he packs in cutting hair, I think he should start giving travel guides, because he always seems to be on the money. And he certainly was with Ghent. Ghent was gorgeous. But initially I was going to go there, and then basically I thought, well, I better go somewhere that's in the Francophone area and see that other kind of side. I thought if I just base myself in the sort of the Flemish part of Belgium, it's not really doing it the full service. So I thought, well, I'll go to Wallonia for a bit, and I thought, well, I may as well go to Liège, because it's kind of the sort of cultural heart of it, and obviously does have quite a rich history football wise. And Liège was a sort of place where obviously it's a bit more industrial. It's maybe slightly less easy on the eye than Ghent, but I love Liège, in fairness. I'd say, actually, weirdly looking back, if anything, I almost preferred Liège to Ghent. I'm not saying I didn't like Ghent. I did love Ghent, but I think maybe because of where I'm from, kind of, growing up around sort of like northeast Wales, northwest of England, like I'm used to being in kind of quite industrial sort of towns. So Liège it was kind of like a home away from home in a way. As I say, both lovely places, and if ever anyone gets the chance to go, if you haven't already, do pop along.
I'm sure plenty of people from Liège will completely agree with you on that one. And yeah, we've heard good things about Ghent, obviously a beautiful city as well. But cities can be beautiful in more ways than just kind of how they look. Kind of following on from that, so obviously you're based in those two places. As someone who's kind of interested in research in different areas, this is kind of the question I really want to ask you: is like, how did you approach researching the book, and how long did it actually take in terms of the overall process of getting all the research down and then turning it into these chapters and the complete book?
Longer than I thought, to be honest. I think in terms of the overall process, I mean, I officially kind of started it like sort of May 2021, but I kind of had been like, doing a little bit of sort of off the cuff research a few months before that. But it was from kind of the beginning of May last year, I was really properly that was kind of all I was really doing on a day-to-day basis. So I kind of started out really just going through like just this list of seasons and kind of just getting, building a sort of I've got an Excel document of basically every single Belgian league season and like the top 5 or 6 finishes, every single cup final and how that finished, and kind of just built it out from there. And then through that, I was able to kind of see like, patterns of when teams were dominant, or, if a particular team came from nowhere and suddenly won the league, and that was an eventful situation. And then that kind of gave me the initial idea of like, you say at the beginning, kind of focusing on that, on Anderlecht, kind of saying, right, okay, well, the fact they won 5 titles in a row in the sort of 60s, that's something that needs to be looked at, because that's unprecedented in Belgium. So it was kind of through doing that kind of gave me the idea of the rough areas that I wanted to go into, and then kind of through that, then I just kind of went deeper into it, and then obviously was able to find like in certain individual characters that I'm sure we'll get onto, who I just thought people would want to read about, and I myself kind of sort of became quite captivated by them and just wanted to find out as much as I could about them, just because, as Scott says, it's kind of this hidden history of players that, I like to think of myself as being pretty well versed in both my knowledge of football and also football history. But there were players that I'd never heard of and I didn't have a clue who they were. And I was just, it kind of through that, it was almost like, well, this is such a fantastic story. Like Roger Klaassen, for example, is such a fantastic character and such a fantastic story that I feel like, I just wanted more people to kind of, find out about him and know about him. But no, in terms of the actual writing process, to answer the sort of final bit of your question, that was, I think I started fully writing it in sort of the end of August, beginning of September, and I finished it. I did finish it. It was quite close to the deadline, to be honest. It was the deadline was the 31st of December, so New Year's Eve, which was not the best way to spend a New Year's Eve. Sort of counting down to 12 o'clock, thinking it's 2 hours to the deadline, and I'm doing a bibliography. But I finished it at I think it was about 10:30 on New Year's Eve. And then basically just sent it off, and kind of it was a bit sort of underwhelming, really. It was like, oh, there you go, it's off. And then I went out to the pub, so it was a bit of a strange ending that I didn't expect. But I guess in many ways that's kind of an epitome of Belgian football for you.
Absolutely. Did it feel? You mentioned before we came on that you were a history graduate. Did it feel like you were back at university, like cramming for that final deadline and like working through the night sort of thing, or did you feel a little bit more kind of like, oh, actually this is a little bit more pressure and not as much of the university lifestyle, I guess?
Yeah, no, it really kind of, I looked back on, when I was sort of concerned about having to write 2,000 words in a week, and I was thinking like that was the life, I remember sort of in terms of the chapters, I think it was the one about Antwerp was a very late edition, because it was annoying because of Omicron, I couldn't actually get to Antwerp, which was a real shame, because it was somewhere I was really looking forward to visiting. I was planning to go there to watch, I can't remember the way the fixtures fell, but I think Antwerp were playing at the weekend, and I think on the Friday night Lierse were at home, so I was going to kind of try and do both of them and sort of stay in Antwerp. But then because of Omicron, I thought, well, I don't want to risk not been able to come home for Christmas, so I'll come home. I think I came home from Belgium the sort of very end of November, and I wasn't really sure. I wanted Antwerp obviously to be in there, but I kind of thought, well, I don't really know where to put them because there's obviously been so many periods where they've kind of been down and not really, I wasn't really sure where historically they fitted. So then in the end, I thought I kind of was not going to leave them out, but I thought, well, I'm not really sure where they fit. But then I thought, given what happened with the 93 and the Cup Winners' Cup, I thought that in itself is a fantastic story. And I also thought I can't possibly, knowing how people from Antwerp are perceived, and I've seen myself, I thought I can't possibly leave Antwerp out because I'd have a lot of angry people from Antwerp. Because everyone else I spoke to in Belgium that wasn't from Antwerp was telling me how stories of people from Antwerp think they are the best in Belgium, and Antwerp is the city and everywhere else is kind of irrelevant. So I thought I've got to put Antwerp in the book. But yeah, that was a very late, as I say, I think I started writing that on Boxing Day.
Wow.
So yeah, that was a little bit of a challenge to get that one in. So yeah, I think, like you say, the idea of this sort of cramming for that final exam, that was kind of like that, but times sort of by 100.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I get you've mentioned that you were out there, like obviously with COVID and stuff, it's hard to watch games, but a lot of like what you describe in the book is kind of the historical stuff. So did you find footage of these old games and watch some of these like great European games, international games in order to get the book, or did you just get the stories from people that kind of were there or kind of saw it firsthand?
In fairness with you, Ben, I tried my hardest to get the footage because I thought, I want to see it firsthand, because it's the sort of thing where, obviously not questioning people, because if you can remember a football game from 50 years ago, like, fair play to you, but people forget, like, maybe the way the goal was scored or who scored it or even the scoreline, stuff like that. So I thought I really want to try and make sure it's as accurate as possible. So I did try and get the footage myself, and then I quite like that, because then I thought, well, like, if I see it, then I can kind of describe it through my own kind of eyes. So yeah, and I mean, it was really a mixture. Like, there were a lot of people who did help. There was a guy that I found called Adrian who was very helpful with all the games Liverpool played against Anderlecht and Club Brugge. He had like full 90-minute match footage of those games. So I was sort of, sitting down and watching that. And there's just other little things. Like, there was a Hearts fan whose name escapes me, but he was very helpful in giving me, he basically had like a scrapbook and then sort of a couple of links to, games that Hearts played against Standard in the sort of early 60s. And it was basically just a case of scouring YouTube and trying as hard as I could to find, just the footage of these strange games. I never thought I'd be sort of, sitting down and trying to Google footage of, like, I don't know, Antwerp against Real Madrid from 1957. But yeah, that's the way my life turned out.
I think there's probably, we've probably given somebody a great idea for a new website and database there, a new streaming site where you can download, the most obscure Belgian league games from yonder years. I actually, when I was doing some of my own research for something a while ago, was amazed to discover that the whole of the '78 European Cup final between Liverpool and Bruges at Wembley is available on YouTube. And I had a great time watching that one night with a beer and a pie.
The way to do it. So we spoke about those games. It's great that you did get to actually watch them. I'm sure there'll be people now who read the book who will then be doing some YouTube searches. So whoever's videos who's got them up is going to get some nice clicks through that. Before you I guess we're kind of going back a little bit to the writing process, but how much of the stories and stuff that you moved into came from, like, maybe you'd write or research one section and something would kind of jump at you from that and you'd be like, I need to chase that down the rabbit hole and kind of pursue that? And how did you kind of manage that process in the sense of, oh, this is really important and this is like another area I want to go down, or actually this is interesting but there's not enough legs on it, or there's not enough information on it to kind of pursue it as a chapter?
Yeah, well, I mean, this was a problem I had with, I always don't like saying smaller teams as someone who supports Wrexham. I always find the term quite demeaning because I know how it feels. But with some of the smaller teams, it was kind of like for example, with Lierse winning the league in '97, it was kind of like that in itself was a ridiculous story, and I really wanted to try and tell that, but I thought there's just not quite enough legs in terms of doing it like across an entire chapter. I just didn't think it had enough legs. Like similarly with like some of the stories of Varahem winning against AC Milan in the 80s, I did drop that little reference to that into a chapter, the one about the 86 World Cup, I think it was. But it just was the sort of thing where it's a real shame because I mean I did actually go to Varahem and I watched them play Genk with a lovely man called Jerry, who I think he's in the acknowledgements. But he was really interesting and was telling me a lot about the history of Varahem and about the merger with Zulta, and that was really interesting. But again, it didn't quite have the legs as a chapter, which was a shame because there was a point where I was thinking in terms of structuring it. Do I just go maybe on a city by city basis, or I was thinking I could almost do it by like the numbering system they have in Belgium and go through it that way. But in the end, it just didn't quite work out. And then on the other side, as you say about kind of just going down rabbit holes, like I think the best one of that would be the one with like the whole Standard Liège that with the match fixing scandal. That was that in itself was something I never expected to find. But then the layers to that was just I couldn't believe like some of the stuff that I found out. It was honestly crazy, and especially it was quite difficult because some of the people I spoke to who were Standard fans were kind of understandably they didn't really want to talk about it. So that was a lot more me having to go out and just try and just do lots of late night reading into Belgium crime from sort of the mid 80s, which again, as I say, is not something that I expected to be doing. But I guess that was really the thrill of it. I mean, that and you say about my degree, that was what I loved about my history degree was I loved being able to find an essay and then just go through and find and uncover all this just strange stuff that you didn't expect to find. So that was the great thing about the process of the book, and one of the main things I enjoyed with it.
I guess on that kind of a little kind of off question is language wise, could you speak French and Dutch, or did you have to kind of rely on translations and people helping you in that sense?
Yeah, no, it was very much translations. I can kind of understand a very, very, very limited amount of French, and then Dutch, I'm nowhere. But no, it was useful because I have quite a few of my close friends are fluent in French, and then just generally, I found most people from the Flemish part of Belgium, they speak decent enough English, and it was the sort of thing where they were kind of, if they were happy enough to be able to get involved and speak to me about the book, they would be happy to translate things for me. Or as I say, like for example, the Varahem fan I spoke to, he basically sent me like an entire history of Varahem that had been translated into English. So yeah, and it was the sort of thing where people were very, very helpful, and yeah, the language wasn't really a massive problem. Sort of, there were one or two quotes, but that was kind of, as I say, that was just, I got around that because I know people who are fluent in Dutch and French, and they were able to translate them for me.
That's great. Let's talk about kind of three of the big figures from the book. How much did you know about these three beforehand, and kind of what was your impressions afterwards? So we're talking kind of like the Raymond Goethals, Ernst Happel, and Guy Thies, like these three kind of big figures. Like, did you know about them before you wrote the book, or did they just appear and you were like, well, I need to get into these guys?
I think extremely characteristic and fitting style. I knew nothing about Raymond Goethals, and then he just sort of spontaneously appeared, and yeah, all these crazy stories just sort of came spilling out. I did know who Ernst Happel was, kind of just generally, as I say, from just having an interest in football history, but I didn't quite understand what Bruges were before he came in, and then kind of the impact he had on building club into what they are. Not so much what they are now, but certainly obviously taking them to kind of unprecedented height. And then similarly, like I knew Guitez existed, but I didn't really know anything else about, what he'd achieved in terms of from where Belgium came when he came in, and like, how the fact that he wasn't really very well received by the press. I just knew that he kind of was in charge of Belgium when they reached the semis in '86. I didn't really know anything beyond that. And then obviously the final of the Euros as well.
I think these three figures are, they kind of loom large over Belgian football. I mean, even if people don't know a lot about them, they're certainly kind of names that, people are are aware of. And there's just so many extraordinary stories about these three figures. I mean, Gotal's obviously hugely charismatic. You can kind of tell that just by looking at, a range of photographs of him, and his behaviour is pretty legendary, and as is his sense of humour. He had a cheek and a charm to obviously the way he behaved that allowed him to get away with quite a lot. And when I was reading the book, and you mentioned obviously the Standard's title win in 1982, which is laced with controversy, because we now know that they got that over the line through match fixing on the final day of the season. I was thinking about this reading the book, and I was aware of, and I'm just curious to see what you think about this in relation to Gotal's, James. Do you think the match fixing in relation to kind of winning the title at Standard and then later on his big Champions League win with Marseille, do you think that taints his career at all in any way? Because his legend looms large, and I was thinking it doesn't seem to have harmed his reputation as this kind of footballing great, and then you discover there's a slight dark layer, shall we say, underneath a lot of it, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the sort of thing where, as I say, given just all the stories that I found out about him and the kind of enjoyment I got of finding out about him, having not really heard of him at all before, I think I'm on sort of erring on the caution of defending him. But I think it's the sort of thing where, yeah, I mean, obviously you can't get away from the fact two of his defining moments of his managerial career were, involved in match fixing that has been proven. I think the Marseille one, I think, is slightly different because that wasn't him specifically that ordered it. That was Tapi that was, and was kind of involved with ownership of Marseille. But then obviously that, I think the thing with Standard is kind of like I mentioned in that chapter. Even then it isn't. I think this is the thing with Belgian football. Nothing is straightforward. Well, I mean Belgium in general, I guess. I think nothing is straightforward, and I think as I say in that chapter, he knew that a lot of things went on at Anderlecht that maybe were slightly questionable, and I think given the context of him going into, I'm not saying it makes it right to fix a game, but given the context of him going into Standard, having kind of left Anderlecht and almost kind of wanting to get one over on them, I think you can kind of, as I say, I'm not condoning match fixing at all, but I think you can kind of understand why he did it. And I think I got the impression there's more to it than meets the eye. Like, for example, the fact that the judge was, seen afterwards going to watch Anderlecht games, and there were sort of conflicting reports that he was actually an Anderlecht season ticket holder. Like, I think there is, I don't think it's as simple as just, they match fixed a game and that was that. I think there is a little bit more to that story than, unfortunately, I was able to kind of uncover. And then I think also, I mean, besides that though, I think it's the sort of thing, like, you look at what he did with both when he was at STVV finishing second, and then also the result he got in 1970. I spoke to a few Belgian people who were very modest when remembering that, and they were saying, oh, well, there were only 4 teams in the tournament. But it's like, well, you say that, but you had to sort of get through the quarterfinal, an effective quarterfinal to get there, and to finish sort of third in the Euros is not exactly a bad achievement. So yeah, I think it's the thing where, as I say, you can't get away from some of the corruption elements that were involved in Gotal's career. But as I say, I think when it comes to the one particularly with Standard, I think there's more to it than meets the eye.
Yeah, I think it doesn't take away from the fact that clearly he was a very good manager.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? There's so much evidence that proves that, without any shadow of a doubt. So he certainly shouldn't be remembered for that. Likewise, Ernst Happel as well. He's obviously another massive figure, and of course, Bruges have just won their 3rd title in a row, their 5th in 7 years. And just to put that in context as well, I mean, that's the first time club have won 3 back-to-back titles since Happel did it in the 70s with them. And Bruges, of course, as the book covers, Bruges are a club who, in Belgian football in terms, are to a large extent kind of nowhere in terms of honours and significance really until the 1970s. That's when they emerge as a a kind of proper force. And I think that's another kind of hidden history here that people don't know about. Most outsiders who don't know anything about Belgian football will know Club Brugge and probably know them ahead of many of the other big sides in Belgium, and assume, along with Anderlecht, that they're the only two in town. But actually, both of them have definite periods in their history, as you were talking about earlier, when you were kind of charting championship wins and the kind of broad story of kind of club developments and honours. There are some surprising things in here, and that's certainly one of them around Bruges. But he's hugely significant, and again a very good coach as well, isn't he? Because he disappears and then comes back in spectacular fashion and takes a job that nobody could have expected.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's the sort of thing where, yeah, I mean, you say about outsiders, you have no idea of Belgian football history. That was exactly what I was faced with when I first found out about Happel at club. Was I was really confused why, up until I think it was like 1976 or something, Circle actually had more titles than league titles than Club Bruges did, and I think that's the thing. I didn't really realise quite how impactful he was, but I think people kind of scoff and say, oh well, it was a different era of football, but to get Club Brugge to 2 European finals in the space of 3 years is ridiculous, quite frankly. And when I spoke to George Lakens as part of it, he was, who played in that side as a defender, he was saying that, if it wasn't for Liverpool that they faced in both those finals and unfortunately lost to, they would have been, a European Cup winning side, if not the one in 78, certainly the UEFA Cup in 76. Because I mean, you look at particularly the first leg. I spoke to a Liverpool fan who was at, I think, yeah, he was at that first leg, and he says, club for the first 20 minutes, half an hour, just completely battered Liverpool. They were 2-0 up, and it could have been even more. And that is, as much down to the players, obviously, but it is down to Happel and his organisational ability. And like you say, Scott, I think that's one of the things I like with the book, is there were so many kind of twists I found with when Happel ends up at sort of the second division managing sort of Harelbeke. It's kind of like, what's gone on here? Obviously it's kind of a bygone era sort of story, but it's really not something you'd expect. And then obviously he goes to Standard and then kind of finds a little bit more success there. So again, someone who I think, as I say, again, he was slightly misrepresented in a similar way to Goethe. It was obviously not through similar sort of means, but he was somebody that I always had the impression was very, very miserable and kind of a disciplinarian, and there wasn't really much there. But then there's a story about when one of the main players in that side, Julian Cools, when his daughter was tragically killed in a car sort of accident, he was very, very humane in that situation. And I think it was nice to see that kind of other side to him come out through the sort of researching him as a person. And it wasn't just a case of being this gruff man who was very good tactically. He was also a very good man manager, and just someone that all the players regarded and respected massively.
Yeah, those sorts of insights are really wonderful, actually, because you don't often get behind the coach terribly often. It's a difficult thing to do. So that insight does tell you a lot about the man, I think, and that's a lovely story in the book. I've often wondered, actually, just while we're on Happel, about 78 against Liverpool at Wembley. I've often wondered, what would have happened had Bruges been able to put out their strongest side that night, because obviously they had a few injuries to 3 or 4 key players. Obviously, Raoul Lambert obviously being the main one, being their main man at that time, which I think hurt them. And when you watch that game, and you can go and watch the whole of the game on YouTube if you want to do that as soon as you've listened to this. One of the things that struck me about that game was Bruges play quite well in the final, but Liverpool are just that, half a yard faster. And more energetic, and that's obviously because they've got their strongest side out. But I do wonder how that result and final would have gone had they had their strongest side out. Guy Thies as well, actually, is if we come on to him, he's obviously lampooned and kind of still is in large quarters. But I personally have always felt that he, a bit like the others, was a genius in his own way. You talk about his handling with the media. And I love the story, particularly about him socialising with journalists in the hotel bars at tournaments and actively asking them off the record, look, who would you play tomorrow in the game? While he's discreetly noting this down and making journalists feel like they're actually involved in the inner sanctum, which I think is, how he mastered that was really pretty special. And I think the results spoke for themselves. So although he's not a character, obviously, who excited people in lots of ways, I think some of his achievements kind of exceed the credit that he was ever given for it as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's the sort of thing where, you look at that team of the 80s, which I think for people, who kind of have a passing knowledge of Belgian football and the history of it, is the team that before the current generation people look to. And obviously, he was there through it. You go through the 80s and that brilliant team, and it was his team. And I think that the general consensus, as I say, that you get is he's not maybe someone that you could regard him as the greatest tactical manager there's ever been, certainly not. But like you say about the way he was with the journalists and also with the players, his man management, his ability to not so much manipulate, that's the wrong word, but his ability to kind of make people feel involved and to kind of really empathise and understand the people he's working with, both the players, but also kind of around the team, I think is something that really shone through and really was kind of a big part of that success. I mean, the players that I sort of spoke to from that period and played under him and, worked alongside him all said that it was the fact that he fostered such a great team spirit. And that was why, obviously, that Belgian team of the 80s was fantastic technically in its own right. But in terms of like the way they were organised defensively and the way they all worked for each other and that sort of just like general team spirit they had, that was all down to Guy Tayson and the way that he set the team up.
I think we should have a chat about the chapter on Heysel and how you approach that, because obviously that's a kind of particularly dark episode in Belgian football history and probably still even today pretty controversial, both inside and outside Belgium. Were you certain very early on that that demands a chapter of its own? And how did you go about approaching that?
Yeah, to tell the truth, Scott, I didn't really want to do it because I thought it was of all the chapters I did. I said before about the Antwerp one, but I knew I wanted to do one on Antwerp. It was just a case of trying to fit it in. But with Heysel, it was kind of I didn't really want to do it because I thought, well, it's not specifically. I'm looking at Belgian football clubs and the national team, and it doesn't really concern either of them. But then when I sort of, thought about it, I thought, and just kind of passingly just looked into it, I thought there's not really any way I can leave this out, because even though it is something that involves a team from Italy and a team from England, it occurred on Belgian soil, and the events that unfolded were, not solely, but certainly very heavily influenced by, the Belgian authorities and the way in which it was staged and it was handled. And I thought, given the impact it had on the world, and I think also the way in which the sort of memory of it exists, I was really shocked by the way in which it's something that, like you say, is very controversial, which when you consider 39 people died, it shouldn't really be something that's controversial, because ultimately people have lost their lives going to watch a football match. It's something that really should be quite transparent and out in the open and really sort of fond sort of memory, but it doesn't really seem to be like that. And I mentioned in the book of when I went to go and watch Belgium Estonia back in sort of November last year, and even then it was really strange going into the stadium and getting inside. It was really kind of cramped, and I think it took me about 25 minutes, half an hour to actually get past all the COVID checks and stuff, which I understand is something that they're going to have to do. But it really did kind of make you think and almost transport you back to kind of that day and really kind of sort of associate with it and think how horrendous it must have been. I remember walking around at the end of the game, I was trying to find just some, the memorial that's now there. And I couldn't find it, which in a way I quite liked. I thought that was very poignant, the fact I couldn't find it, which is how I sort of conclude that chapter. But I think, as you say, it's something that that was of all the chapters I wrote, that was the one I was most unsure about doing, because I thought I don't want to, because there's so many strong opinions on it, I don't want to come at it from, arguing too strongly for one side. I want to just present an unbiased account of what happened, which I feel like I did to the best of my ability. Hopefully people feel like it is a respectful enough chapter, because, as I say, it was something that, because it's beyond football, it was quite difficult for me to think about doing. But yeah, like I say, ultimately I thought it occurred in Belgium and it was very impactful on the future of football, so I've got to put it in there.
I think it's right to be in there. I think your call there was definitely the right one because of how significant it is. And even today, actually, I mean, building new stadiums in Belgium is notoriously difficult, as a lot of people who listen to the BFP regularly will know. Obviously the most recent stadium in Belgium is Ghent's one. But a lot of the stadium infrastructure in Belgium is actually very old and in modern stadium terms pretty out of date. So even today there are still those sort of bureaucratic issues that go to the heart of the Heysel story, if you like, are obviously still prevalent because of how, I suppose, slightly out of date the footballing structure still remains in that sense in Belgium. And it's just so interesting. And you actually mentioned this in the book as well, that when the stadium was later redeveloped and becomes the King Bedouin, the stadium we know today, which, as you rightly say, still isn't a great stadium. It's obviously a lot safer than it was, but in modern stadium terms, it definitely still lacks a lot in many different ways, particularly from a fan's experience point of view. But the Belgian people, a lot of people felt that was, as you say in the book, kind of an admittance of Belgian cultural guilt and fault in their part in what happened there. And only recently the Belgian FA have announced, very recently, in fact, just over the last month or so, that they no longer have any plans, even on the shelf, to redevelop that site or build a new stadium on that site. And I found that that news kind of quite distasteful, because I've always felt, as somebody who is looking at this as an outsider to Belgian culture and somebody who's not Belgian, that to me the idea of perhaps a new stadium or a partially redeveloped one on that site could potentially be the greatest possible long-term memorial to that, rather than obviously kind of trying to pretend in lots of respects that it didn't happen. So it's interesting that the chapters in the book where it is, and it assumes obviously that people are coming at it afresh. And I think it was one of the most interesting chapters to read, because I thought, if you have an awareness of the name Heysel, which I think a lot of football fans do, they probably don't know the detailed story unless they're a Juventus or a Liverpool fan. A great chapter, that one.
As I say, with that one, it was something that I do remember really. Like I say, I really did think about, is this something I should do or not? But I think, having kind of read, there was a particularly brilliant book by, I was in touch with the author of it. He's called, I think it's Francesco, I can't remember his surname. I'll have to have a look. I can't remember. But anyway, I'll have to have a think. But he wrote a fantastic book, and I was in contact with him, and I got sort of his opinion. And he actually had I think it was a friend of his who basically who died at Heysel, and he gave a fantastic account of the events, and he was extremely. I think Francesco Caramani, that's it. But that was a fantastic book. It was really interesting to get like a Juventus perspective on it, and then also I spoke to a Liverpool fan who was at the game, obviously on the Liverpool side, and it was interesting to get their opinions. And I felt, as I say, as a history kind of grad, I wanted to get both sides of the story and kind of make sure there wasn't any bias in it. So I'm pleased that you enjoyed it, Scott, and that you felt like it didn't sort of contain that kind of that sort of narrative.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is so important with those sort of things like that, isn't it, to try and get all the sides of the story and, like you said, kind of approach it in a non-biased way. I guess our last question before we wrap things up is probably one that has a little bit more bias in it, because we kind of agree with the statement that you made. You mentioned that Belgium is one of the most significant footballing nations on earth. I mean, obviously that's music to our ears, but what during the book, like, what was it during the book that made you think, during the process, that you're like, actually, yeah, this is far more significant a country in footballing history than maybe you thought, we thought, most people will think, until they get through the book and read it and realise?
I don't think, to be honest with you, Ben, there was one specific thing. I think it was just when you put everything together and you add it all together, the amalgamation of it, it just makes you think, well, there is just so much, there's so many firsts when you go right back to the beginning of the book, and you're talking about like the first international between two independent countries in Europe. You've got the first league in mainland Europe, like just these little nuances that you maybe wouldn't necessarily think of really associating with Belgium, right through to kind of, as I say, there were so many players that kept cropping up where it was, I've lost count of the amount of times, and I had to omit some of them from the book because I thought otherwise it's just going to be this player, and then the little profile of him is going to be who Real Madrid tried to sign, or AC Milan tried to sign, but they weren't able to because of restrictions and sort of black money that was involved in Belgium and stuff like that. Because I think this is the thing, is that unless you realise that, you kind of just look at it and think, oh well, all these players stayed in Belgium, they can't have been that good. But I think that's just a really it's just a really closed-minded way of looking at it, because when you look at the way that these players were perceived, right through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, I mean, I could keep going. You've got players who, were considered some of the best, if not the best in the world in their position. You've got players who, are finishing 4th and 5th in Ballon d'Ors, who the average football fan wouldn't have heard of. And you look at, obviously, Jean-Marc Bosman himself, that the impact that had on football and continues to have on football today. Like, there's just so many stories that ultimately all come together, and I kind of thought it is just incredible how much there is out there. I mean, I have to be honest, I was completely taken aback by the amount of stuff I found. I had no idea that it would be, even close to this sort of stuff. Initially the book was mainly going to be about more the current team, but then kind of just through reading in the history and just kind of, as I say, my own kind of intrigue of going further back and further back, we got back to sort of 1863 or whatever. And there was just, as I say, there was just every couple of years, there was just something that was interesting that was cropping up that I thought, well, that's got to go in the book. And ultimately, as I say, it all came together, and I just thought there's just so much in here that I think you can't say anything but, in terms of history and the impact on the game, there's not many countries, certainly in terms of the size of Belgium, that have had as much of an impact on world football.
It's really interesting, that, isn't it? Because the early part of the book is quite keen to emphasise how introverted Belgian culture is generally, and how, in comparison to their near neighbours, obviously the Dutch, who are very self-confident for the most part, and will tell you very directly what they think. Belgian people are naturally more reserved. So it's so interesting that goes hand in hand with this brilliant book, which has uncovered so many hidden histories around players who clearly were world class, actually, but have flown under the radar, just arguably partially because they're from Belgium, and culturally Belgium does not like to raise its head above the parapet, or kind of shout too loudly about its own successes. And for a country of its size and its infrastructure, it has consistently over a number of generations punched well above its weight. And the book even goes through the kind of trough. We get to the sort of mid-90s, you get the fallout from Bosman, and that being much more significant in terms of how it impacts upon Belgian football's decline over an unexpected period, before people have to kind of knock their heads together and go, okay, how are we going to sort this out again? Which was achieved spectacularly when there's a kind of revolution in academies with coaching, which is obviously still going on today. And it just comes back to, and we tell people this a lot, there's an acceptance now, isn't there? And again, you acknowledge this in the book, that because of Bosman, largely Belgian clubs recognise that they can't compete financially with the elite leagues for players anymore, and TV revenues linked to this, but that what they do very well is produce young players and provide an environment where young players can flourish and become world class. And most clubs, obviously, in Belgium have an operating model now, including Club Brugge to a certain extent, even though they are by far the wealthiest at the moment, of nurturing talent with a view to the kind of selling model.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much a case that I think you look at how Belgian clubs performed in the 70s and 80s, and I think, if anything, it was almost kind of what happened post-Bosman. It was almost as if they were a victim of their own success, in the sense that because they were so used to regularly knocking, giant European clubs out of Europe, or playing against them in finals and semi-finals, that there was almost this idea that Belgium could continue to get back to that level almost, and continue to compete at that level. And like you say, Scott, it did take a while for, people to come together and think, right, okay, we need to, redefine our approach here and come at this from a new angle, and not so much look to compete with these teams anymore, but find our new place in the world. And obviously now Belgian clubs have found their place in the world to a very good degree, in terms of, you look at the players that around Europe have played in Belgian clubs and developed in Belgian clubs. And I think particularly what I find interesting is there's so many of them that aren't Belgian. I think that's something that is really interesting. It shows that we talk about the sort of like Belgian culture and how Belgian people are generally, and the fact that I think Belgian people are very, on the whole, very adaptable. And I think that's obviously helpful for all these players you have coming from Africa and former Yugoslav countries and things like that, who can come to Belgium and find their feet and then kick on and go to a bigger league. So I think, as I say, through the process of writing the book, I just fell in love with Belgium. So it's the sort of thing where, looking at the current team and stuff like that in itself was a joy to do as well. Both the way that the team has fallen and risen is, I think that in itself is a fantastic story. As I say, that was the initial idea for the book, was kind of, why did they decline and why have they recovered? But like I say, with the amount of history that I found, I thought, well, I can't leave all this out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've definitely proven what it says on the cover, why Belgian football is more than one generation. And I know me and Scott talk about it and Joris talk about it, but like, even the next generation to come, there's some exciting young players coming through, and they're going to keep producing good players, and people are going to keep watching Belgian players on the big stage because they've just got the system right at the moment. Anyway, James, we've probably taken up enough of your time. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm sure everyone listening has really appreciated hearing kind of the behind the scenes, kind of behind the curtain, behind kind of how the books come about and everything like that. One last question I did have for you: is there anything kind of, now that you've finished this, like, what's kind of, you got another project on the way or any other ideas? Are you just kind of relaxing and just enjoying a bit of a football free period before looking at the next thing?
Not really, to be honest. I mean, on Sunday I was at the National League promotion final between Grimsby and Solihull, which, considering that, as I say, I'm a Wrexham fan, and for those that don't follow the National League, Grimsby knocked Wrexham out in the semi-finals. It was a bit strange. I ended up at watching that game. A very good friend of mine is a Solihull fan, so I went as moral support. But no, I'm certainly not shying away from football. In terms of more general, I'm just looking for a job. If anybody has a job going, then it'd be appreciated. But no, I think in terms of a future project book-wise, it's the sort of thing. And when I finished it, I said, no, that's it. I can't possibly do that again. But now, the longer it's gone on, and having seen it come out, and having people filtering through and saying, oh, I'm really enjoying this, and well done and stuff, I'm thinking, well, maybe there is another one on the horizon at some point. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, definitely good luck with that. And yeah, if anyone does have a job for James, reach out. Definitely well worth it. But thank you so much. And we kind of teased at the beginning that if you haven't got a copy of the book yet, we do have a signed copy to give away to one very lucky listener. To enter, you will need to go onto our Twitter account at Belgian Podcast. Then you'll find the tweet that we've kind of put on there. You basically just need to retweet and like that. Follow us, obviously. Follow James, obviously. And then just tag a friend in the post as well. We'll probably run it for a week to 10 days. Then we'll draw the winner at random and get in touch with you and send you a copy of the book over. Obviously, if you don't win the signed copy, just get one anyway. It's absolutely well worth it. And yeah, we've been really enjoying it. Like I said, I'm almost basically halfway through, going to carry it on tonight. I've basically put a massive backlog of reading aside to get through this. It's definitely been worth it. And Scott, as he said, finished it very, very quickly, basically raced through it. But anyway, I've rambled on for long enough. James, thank you so much for joining us for this one. And yeah, good luck as it goes forward. And as the book keeps getting good reviews, I'm sure it will.
Oh, thanks very much. And as I say, thanks for having me on. And I will continue to... I gave you a mention in the acknowledgements, but I will continue to, you've gained a fan for life, both in terms of Belgian football and obviously the pod. And yeah, I will continue to eagerly listen, and I can't wait to see what the off season holds in terms of the moves that clubs make and the way next season goes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely more to come from the Belgian league, and you've read about the drama in the book. There's probably going to be more drama along the way. Scott, as ever, thank you for joining me, and listeners, Thank you very much for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this special episode of the Belgian Football Podcast. We'll be back again at some point with an end of season rewards special. And then I think the next episode will probably be the bumper pre-season preview. Lots of clubs making moves already, so we're definitely looking forward to that. If you've enjoyed the episode, as per usual, please do leave us a review on your podcasting app of choice. If you've got any questions, get in touch with us in the usual way, and we'll speak to you very soon on another episode of the Belgian Football Podcast.